The room went completely silent. Not the polite kind of silence that settles over a crowd when someone taps a glass for a toast. This was different. This was the kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind that presses against your chest and makes the air feel thick. I was standing just inside the doorway of the banquet hall at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, wearing my dress uniform for the first time in what felt like forever. And every single person in that room had stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped breathing, maybe. And somewhere near the head table, I heard my father's voice cut through that silence like it always had. Sharp, dismissive, certain of itself. Oh, for goodness' sake, she would. I hadn't spoken to him in 11 months. Let me back up. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. The kind of northern city that people from Toronto mention once and then forget about. My parents had lived there their whole lives. My father worked for 30 years at the nickel smelter before he retired. My mother taught grade 4 at a French immersion school on the east end of town. We weren't poor, but money was careful, precise. Every dollar had somewhere it was supposed to go. There were 2 of us kids, me and my younger brother, my brother Callum. No, wait, I need to check the list. I'll call him something else. My brother, 4 years younger than me, which as children felt like a generation, and as adults felt like nothing at all. He was the easy one. That's not a criticism. He was genuinely easy, good-natured, funny, the kind of person who makes friends in line at the grocery store. My father adored him. Everyone did. I was the difficult one. Not in the way of tantrums or rebellion, though there was some of that too. I was difficult because I wanted things my parents didn't understand and couldn't quite picture. I read too much. I asked too many questions at the dinner table. I got good grades and then complained that school wasn't challenging enough, which my father found ungrateful. You know what your problem is? He said to me once, when I was maybe 14, and had just come home from some regional academic competition I'd placed first in. He didn't ask how it went. He looked up from the hockey game he was watching and said, "You think you're better than this place. Better than us." I didn't think that. I just wanted more than this place. I didn't know yet that those are 2 different things. When I was 17, a recruitment officer came to our high school to talk about the Canadian Armed Forces, specifically about the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston. Full tuition, a degree, a career, officer training. I sat in that assembly and felt something unlock in my chest that I hadn't known was locked. I went home and told my parents at dinner. My father put down his fork. "You want to join the military," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the tone he used when he was already deciding the answer to something. "I want to apply to RMC," I said. "If I get in, they cover everything. The whole degree. I'd graduate as an officer." "Your cousin Bridget went to Laurentian," my mother said carefully. "She's doing very well in nursing." I knew what that meant. I knew what they were comparing. My father picked his fork back up. "It's a hard life," he said. "You'd be following orders your whole career. You'd move every few years. You'd never have anything stable." He shook his head. "I don't see why you'd do that to yourself." "Because I want to," I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his face that I'd seen before and never quite named until much later. It wasn't anger. It was something smaller than anger and somehow worse. It was the refusal to take me seriously. "You'll change your mind," he said, and reached for the salt. I didn't change my mind. I applied. I got in. My father drove me to Kingston in August with the car packed and barely said a word the whole 6-hour drive. When we got there and he helped me carry boxes up to my room in the dormitory, he shook my hand at the door. Not a hug, a handshake, and said, "Be careful." That was it. Be careful. I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the lot and kept waiting to feel something definitive. Grief, maybe. Or relief. I felt both, and neither fully. And then someone knocked on my door to tell me there was a mandatory briefing in 20 minutes. And I didn't have time to feel anything at all. That was 22 years ago. I was 39 years old standing in that doorway at the Fairmont. By that point, I had served 2 tours of duty, one in Latvia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence, and one in a non-combat capacity in Iraq as part of the training mission. I had a master's degree from the Royal Military College, which I completed through distance learning while stationed in Petawawa. I had been promoted 8 times. I was, at the time of my brother's wedding, a lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Army. Specifically in the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals, which is the branch responsible for military communications. I had spent 22 years building a life my father had told me I would regret. I did not regret it, not one day of it. But I want to be honest here. Because this isn't a story about how I had everything figured out. I didn't. There were postings I hated. There were relationships that didn't survive the distance. There were nights in base housing, in Gagetown, New Brunswick, when the fog came in off the river, and I was 31 and eating cereal for dinner alone, wondering if my father had been right about the stable part, at least. I called home less and less as the years went on, not because I didn't love my parents. I did. In the complicated way you love people who shaped you in ways you're still unpacking. but because the calls always ended the same way. My mother would ask about the weather wherever I was posted. My father would ask if I had a boyfriend. And when I'd say no, he'd make a small sound that meant he was connecting that to my career choices. And then he'd tell me what my brother was up to. My brother was living 20 minutes from our parents. He'd married a lovely woman named, I'll call her my sister-in-law, since names aren't the point, a few years back, and they were building a house in Lively, which is a little community just outside Sudbury. He worked in mining logistics. He came for dinner every Sunday. He was, by my father's accounting, doing everything right. Your brother knows how to put down roots, my father told me once, during one of our strained Christmas calls. Some people need that. Not everyone is cut out for the kind of life you chose. I let it go. I always let it go. 11 months before my brother's wedding, I didn't let it go. I had just returned from a 6-month deployment rotation. I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't quite fix, the kind of tired that lives in your joints and behind your eyes. I'd applied for a teaching position at the Canadian Forces School of Communications and Electronics in Kingston, which would have let me stay in one place for 2 years, maybe more. I was thinking about what the next chapter of my life looked like. My father called me on a Tuesday night. I remember because I'd just made pasta and was sitting on the couch of my rental apartment in Ottawa, still in my running clothes. He'd been reading something about the defense budget cuts. There had been news articles that week. The government was announcing reductions in certain areas, and journalists were doing their usual coverage about what it meant for the military. My father had read one of these articles, which I know, because he quoted from it almost verbatim. Sounds like it's not such a secure career after all, he said. Always said it. No pension is worth what you give up. I have a pension. A very good one. I didn't say that. Dad, I said. I'm happy. You're 38 years old, he said. You've been doing this for 20 years. You have nothing to show for it. Something went very still in me. Nothing to show for it, I said. No house, no family. You move every 2 years. You could have. I have a career, I said. I have a rank. I have 2 tours and a commendation and a degree, and I have built something. And the fact that you have never once, not once in 22 years, asks me a single question about what I do or what it means to me, or whether I'm good at it. I stopped. I heard him breathing. I'm just being honest, he said. I know, I said. You always are. I hung up. I didn't call back. He didn't call either. For 11 months. My brother's wedding was at the Fairmont in Ottawa, because my sister-in-law had always wanted that specific venue and my brother had spent 3 years quietly saving for it. I found this out from my mother, who texted me the details with a careful neutrality that I recognized as her version of peacekeeping. I had been invited. Of course I had. My brother and I had a different relationship than my father and I did. We texted. We called. We had a standing video call every few weeks that usually lasted 2 hours and covered everything from politics to what we'd been watching. He knew about the fight with our father, and he had the grace not to take sides explicitly, while also being clear that he wanted me there. I want you there, he said in the text he sent me when he formally asked. I mean that. Whatever's going on with Dad. I need my sister at my wedding. I was going to go in civilian clothes. That was my plan. I owned perfectly good civilian clothes. I had a gray blazer and dark trousers I'd worn to a colleague's retirement dinner and felt fine in. The week of the wedding, I mentioned this to a friend of mine, a fellow officer I'd served with in Latvia, who was also attending the wedding, because she and my brother had become friends over the years. One of those small world connections that happen when someone is good at being liked. Are you serious? She said. We were on the phone. You're a lieutenant colonel. There's going to be half the people in that room in uniform. It's a civilian event. It's a formal military wedding for someone whose sister is a lieutenant colonel, she said. There will be veterans there. There will be active personnel there. You showing up in a blazer is actually going to be weirder. I thought about it. I thought about my father's voice saying you have nothing to show for it. I wore my uniform. I arrived at the Fairmont on a Friday afternoon. The rehearsal dinner was that evening. I'd checked in and was still in my room when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I recognized even after 11 months. I heard you're wearing your uniform tomorrow. Your brother's day is about his wife, not your career. Please consider being appropriate. I read it 3 times. I set my phone face down on the bed and stood at the window looking out at the Rideau Canal, which was flat and gray-green in the October light, and I counted the boats moored along the far bank until I felt calm enough to think. I did not text back. At the rehearsal dinner, my father and I sat at opposite ends of the long table. My mother watched us both the way she'd been watching us both for 11 months, with an expression that mixed love and helplessness in equal measure. My brother made a toast that was generous and warm, and made my sister-in-law cry and made everyone else laugh. My father laughed too. He was good at dinners. He didn't speak to me directly, but at one point, when we were all moving from the table to the small reception room for drinks, he came close enough that I could hear him say something to the man next to him. An uncle of my sister-in-law's. Someone I didn't know. My daughter, he said, in a tone that was almost amused. She's very attached to the military life. Some people find an identity in it. I kept walking. That night in my room, I almost texted my friend to say I was going to wear the blazer after all. I didn't. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because somewhere underneath everything, I was tired of making myself smaller to take up less of my father's line of sight. Maybe because I had earned what I was wearing. And 22 years is a long time to apologize for something you don't regret. I laid my uniform out across the chair by the window and went to sleep. The next day, October 19th, the wedding was at 3 o'clock. I arrived at the Fairmont's Grand Ballroom at 2:45. I was early, which is a habit I can't shake no matter how hard I try. The room was filling up. There were easily 200 guests, and the guest list for a wedding like this in Ottawa, with my brother's work and social connections, and my father's extended family, and my sister-in-law's family coming in from across the country, was a full cross-section of people from a lot of different worlds. Including, I realized as I moved through the room, quite a few from mine. I recognized a brigadier general I had met at a training exercise in Wainwright 2 years before. I recognized 2 captains I had served with in Petawawa. I saw near the back a colonel whose retirement ceremony I had attended in Trenton just that spring. These were not people who would have been surprised to see me in uniform. They were surprised, I could tell, that I was here, because the worlds of professional and personal rarely overlap so completely. I found my seat, which was at a table near the middle of the room. My father was at the head table with my brother and sister-in-law. My mother was at a table to the right, with extended family. I was, diplomatically, at a table with some of my brother's closest friends. People who knew me, liked me, would provide a buffer. The ceremony was beautiful. My sister-in-law walked down the aisle to something from a Norah Jones album and looked genuinely radiant in a way that I don't use that word lightly. My brother cried before she reached him, and didn't try to hide it, which made me love him more than I already did. The vows they'd written themselves were specific and fussy and sincere, in exactly the right proportions. I cried a little. Quietly. I don't think anyone noticed except my friend sitting 2 seats away, who reached over without looking and squeezed my hand once. After the ceremony, the room shifted for dinner. There was wine. And the catering was exceptional. The Fairmont does not do things by half. The toasts began. My father stood up and gave a speech that was, I'll admit, quite good. He talked about my brother as a boy, and then as a man, with genuine pride and warmth that was completely real. I knew it was real, because I'd seen him look at my brother my whole life with that expression, and it had never been performance. That's the part that has always been hardest. He wasn't a cold man. He wasn't cruel. He was specifically incapable of extending certain things to me specifically, and I still don't fully understand why, and I've spent a lot of years trying not to make it mean more than it means. I was picking up my water glass when it happened. Not dramatically, not with a drum roll. The colonel I'd recognized from Trenton was walking past my table, and he stopped when he saw me and he said without any particular volume, Lieutenant Colonel, good to see you here. He wasn't loud, but the colonel from Petawawa heard, and he half stood to nod. And the brigadier general, who happened to be looking in our direction, also rose slightly. And then one of the captains stood fully. I don't know exactly when it spread. These things happen by instinct in military culture. Something between protocol and genuine respect. The kind of reflex that training builds into you until it's automatic. But within about 30 seconds, every person in that room who wore a uniform or had ever worn one was on their feet. 30 or 40 people, at minimum. Some of them I knew, many I didn't. Veterans from the Afghanistan mission. A retired RKF pilot. Someone in the scarlet dress uniform of the RCMP who straightened to full attention. It was not choreographed, it was not planned. It was the thing that happens when military people recognize rank and service without being asked to. The room had gone completely silent. I didn't know what to do. I'm going to be honest about that. 22 years in the Canadian Armed Forces had given me a great many skills, and managing being unexpectedly honored at my brother's wedding reception was not among them. I stood up, because sitting while everyone else was standing felt wrong, and I looked at the colonel from Trenton, who gave me a small nod that meant, it's okay. This is what you've earned. From somewhere near the head table, I heard my father's voice. Not the dismissive version this time. The uncertain one. What's happening? My brother, bless him, bless my brother completely, leaned over and said something in our father's ear. I couldn't hear what it was. But I watched my father's face change. That's the moment I want to talk about, because it's not what I expected and not what I would have scripted. He didn't look proud, exactly. Not immediately. He looked like a man who had just realized that he had been reading a map upside down for 22 years, and had only now turned it right side up. He looked genuinely confused. Not in a foolish way. In the way of someone having a quiet, private reckoning, in the middle of a very public room. He looked at me from across that silent ballroom, and for a moment, his face was entirely unguarded. Then people began sitting back down, and conversations resumed, and a server came around with more wine, and the world moved on the way it does. I didn't approach my father that night. I think I needed to not be the one who crossed the room. My mother found me near the end of the evening, when the dancing had started and the atmosphere had shifted to something warmer and looser. She touched my arm and steered me gently toward a quiet spot near the tall windows overlooking the canal. "He doesn't know how to say it," she said, without preamble. She said it the way she said things that she had been thinking for a very long time and had finally decided to say. "I know," I said. "He's told other people." She paused. "He talks about you. He just doesn't know how to talk to you." I looked at her. "Your Aunt Francine told me," she said, "at Christmas time. She said your father had gone on for 20 minutes at dinner about some training exercise you'd been written up about. She said she'd thought he'd been talking about someone he didn't know, at first, because of the way he sounded." My mother smiled, and it was a small, complicated smile, like he was describing someone extraordinary. I didn't say anything. I wasn't capable of it, right at that moment. "I have something for you," she said. She reached into her handbag and produced a small envelope, a regular business envelope, the kind you'd buy at Staples in a box of 50. My name was on the front in my father's handwriting. "He asked me to give you this," she said. "Tonight, before the end of the night." She pressed it into my hand. "That's all I know. That's everything I know." She kissed my cheek and went back to the dance floor, where she had apparently been dancing with one of my sister-in-law's uncles, and was not finished. I held the envelope for a long moment. Then I walked to the end of the hallway, found a small alcove near the coat check where it was quiet, and opened it. There was no letter. Just a single folded piece of paper. When I opened it, I realized it was a photocopy. An old one. The paper was slightly degraded, the way photocopies of photocopies get after many years. The original had been a newspaper article. The Sudbury Star, the masthead said, and the date was March 14th, 2009. "Local woman earns captain's commission. Sudbury's Lynn Okafor becomes first in family to reach officer rank. Lynn Okafor." That's not my real name for this story, but that's the name in the headline. Below it, my father had written 4 words in blue pen, in his careful engineer's handwriting. I always kept these. I leaned against the wall of that alcove in the Fairmont Chateau Laurier on a Friday night in October, in my dress uniform, holding a photocopy of a 15-year-old newspaper article, and I completely fell apart for approximately 4 minutes. Nobody walked by. Or if they did, they had the good grace to keep walking. I did go to him, eventually. Later in the evening, when the dancing was in full swing, and the noise made it easier to talk without it feeling like a performance. He was sitting at the edge of the head table with a glass of rye whiskey, and the slightly dazed expression of a man who had attended a very full day. He looked older than I always expected him to look when I saw him after a gap. He would be 71, that December. I sat down in the empty chair beside him. He looked at me. I looked at him. 2 of the most stubborn people I have ever met, sitting together in a very expensive hotel, surrounded by other people's joy. "I got your note," I said. He nodded. He turned his glass in his hands. "I've been following it," he said. "Your whole career. I didn't always understand what I was reading. The postings, the ranks. I had to look some of it up." He paused. "You've been places I couldn't find on a map." "Latvia," I said. "I sent you a postcard." "I kept that too," he said. We sat with that for a moment. "I didn't know how to be proud of something I didn't understand," he said finally. And he said it the way people say the thing they should have said years ago. Not easily, but with the weight of all the time it took to get there. And I think I was afraid of what it meant, that you'd go somewhere and not come back. I understood that. I hadn't understood it before. But sitting there in that chair, at 60% of my father's age, I understood that fear can look like dismissal, and that sometimes the people who love you most are the worst at showing it. Not because they don't feel it, but because the feeling is too large and they have no language for it. That's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. 22 years of not asking a single question about my work is not explained away by fear, but I was 39 years old and I was so tired of carrying the weight of his silence like it was something I had caused. "Dad," I said, "I'm good at this. I'm actually really good at this." He looked at me. "I know," he said. "I saw that tonight." A pause. "I think I knew before tonight. We didn't hug. That's not something we do easily, and forcing it would have undone it." But he reached over and put his hand briefly on my arm, the way he'd done when I was small, and had done something he thought was brave, and I let myself feel it for what it was. My brother came over then, because he has always had impeccable timing, and also because he had almost certainly been watching from across the room, and he pulled up a chair and the 3 of us sat together for a while, talking about nothing in particular, the way families sometimes do when they've just survived something, and don't quite have words for the relief. I drove back to Ottawa the next afternoon through the Shield country, where the rock face cuts right down to the highway, and the lakes sit low in the October light. I had the radio off. I do that sometimes when I need to think. I kept coming back to the photocopy in my jacket pocket. I always kept these. Those 4 words, and what they contained, and what they hadn't. The truth is, I don't know what my relationship with my father becomes from here. I'm not going to tell you that one night in a ballroom, and one envelope fixed 22 years of distance, because that would be a lie and you'd know it. But something shifted. Something in the foundation of the thing moved, just slightly, the way foundations sometimes do, not breaking, not collapsing, just settling into a new position. I pulled into my parking spot in the Glebe neighborhood, just off Bank Street, where I'd been renting an apartment for the past 8 months. The neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard next door. Someone on the street was burning leaves. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. I sat in my car for a minute before I went inside. 22 years of carrying the wrong version of the story. The version where his silence meant I didn't matter. And maybe it was never that simple. And maybe it was never going to be resolved in a single conversation. But maybe, the version of the story I carry forward is allowed to be a little more complicated than the one I'd been holding. I got out of the car. The air smelled like October in Ontario. Cold and clean and mineral, the way it gets before the first hard frost. I went inside. I made tea. I called my brother to say I'd gotten home safely. And he answered on the second ring the way he always does. And we talked for almost an hour, and at some point, I started laughing at something he said, and couldn't stop. I am a lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces. I have served this country for 22 years. I have been to Latvia and Iraq and Wainwright and Petawawa, and a dozen postings in between. And I have never once regretted the choice I made at 17, in a high school assembly in Sudbury, Ontario. I don't need my father to have understood that from the beginning. I needed him to understand it eventually. That's enough. For now, that's enough.